All right. Thank you all for coming, and welcome to the in-kind benefits versus direct cash. My name is Erica Wright. I'm a member of the planning committee for this year's conference, and I also work for Income Movement. This session was brought to you by our generous support from our sponsors. That's the Gerald Huff Fund for Humanity, Humanity Forward Foundation, Aid Kit, and Steady. Before we begin, I want you to be aware that this session is being recorded and will be available to view on Crowdcast after the conference, and you can visit our website for more information. Now I'd like to introduce our panelists here. We're going to start here with Max Guinness. He is the founder of UBI Center and the co-founder of Policy Engine. We also have Tal Ook, who's also an intern at Policy Engine. Further down, we have Dr. Tracy Smith-Carrier. She is the associate professor and part of the Canadian Research Chair. She works at Royal Roads University. She's working on advancing the UN Sustainable Development Goals in the School of Humanitarian Studies, and as I mentioned, at the Royal Roads University. And her daughter here, Emma Smith-Carrier, she is a recent grade 12 graduate at Royal Bay Secondary School in British Columbia. She has been a basic income advocate for the past 5 years. And we're going to start with Max and Tal, who are going to focus on the use of the Policy Engine to compare different child care subsidies to direct cash.
Fantastic. Thank you. Great to be here, everyone. My name is Max Guinness. I'm here with my colleague Tola. I'm going to take this out. And we're going to talk about some benchmark studies that we've done using, using our software Policy Engine, which is a free open source app for computing the impact of public policy. So what I thought we'd do is just talk about a few of the ways that the US currently subsidizes childcare, and there are kind of more than meets the eye. So we'll give examples of that. Also how childcare expenses affect, in particular, two benefits, two programs. So the SNAP program is actually affected by childcare dependent expenses, which means it is effectively a childcare subsidy as well. And also one tax program, in particular, the Child and Dependent Care Tax Credit. So we'll talk about the budgetary impact of those. Actually, Tola will go through also the impact of replacing those with a universal young child allowance. And we'll finally talk about the future areas of research in this space. So as I said, the US subsidizes childcare in actually quite a few ways today. So you may have heard of some of these. For example, the pre-K program offers free childcare. There's also the CCDF, Childcare Dependent Development Fund, which is a program that directly subsidizes childcare expenses for low-income families. And there's also things you may not have heard of as much. So the Child and Dependent Care Credit is a tax program, and 24 states actually have their own versions of that as well. So they might match the federal program or have some variation on it, which also provides tax credits for your dependent care expenses. And also, probably the most hidden is the fact that a lot of benefit programs allow you to deduct your childcare expenses when computing your net income, which is then used to determine what level of the benefit you receive. So we'll talk about SNAP today, but also this applies to subsidized housing, like the Housing Choice Voucher, Section 8, and TANF. So TANF is the cash welfare program, and in some states you can also deduct expenses from that. And I think to connect it to the theme of this conference, these actually, another way of thinking about these are conditional benefits. So essentially it's ways in which families receive assistance conditional on their choice to send their children to child care facilities. So yeah, we're going to talk about two programs in particular, the Child and Dependent Care Tax Credit, or CDCC. Sometimes you'll see it CDCTC. So this is separate, I should say, from the Child Tax Credit, which has been in the news, of course. This is a non-refundable credit, which means that if you're low income, you don't receive the benefit. If you have zero earnings because you're not going to pay federal income tax, this tax credit will not reduce your liability below zero. So it sort of by design excludes the poorest families. For a lot of claimants, it basically subsidizes 20% of your childcare expenses up to $3,000 per child. So there is no phase out. Millionaires get it, and it phases in via this non-refundability. So here are a couple charts just showing how it will, this is on the x-axis your earnings, it'll go up, it sort of peaks, it has a kind of weird formula, and then it stabilizes around that $600 credit, or 20% of $3,000. There's also the SNAP dependent care deduction. So SNAP allotments are based on the difference between your maximum allotment, which is based on your household size and your state in some states, and your, a portion of your net income. So you can deduct certain expenses like your shelter cost, some medical expenses, and you can actually deduct your entire childcare expenses. There's no cap for childcare expenses that you can deduct from net income. Also, some people will, if they have childcare expenses, become newly eligible for SNAP, and SNAP entitles you to other programs, for example, free school meals. So you can actually have eligibility via childcare expenses for non-SNAP programs. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tola to talk about some of the math behind our computations.
Thank you. So here we look at an example of a family. They have an income of about $2,500 a month, and we compare whether they use childcare or not. So without using any childcare services, they're not eligible for Cdcc or SNAP, and they only eligible for the reduced price of school meal, about $765. And if they use childcare service, about $500 a month, they're eligible for CDC, about $560, and also $1,000 of SNAP deductions. And because of that, they're also eligible for full school meal subsidies of almost $900. And so with childcare, if they use childcare, they actually have extra benefit of almost $1,700. So we want to see how much, what would be the effect be if we actually replace those CDCC and SNAP with, and SNAP deduction with the child allowance. And actually there's a study done by Lieu Center last year that suggests that if we replace the childcare, childcare with the child allowance, they will reduce poverty by more than twice. And also there's some interest with the legislatively through the Romney Family Security Act that's considering replacing the CDCC with child allowance. So there's some interest in that area too. So to do that, we want to see how much each one cost. The CDCC cost about $3.35 billion a year, and the SNAP dependent care deduction costs about $1.1 billion a year. So that's a total of about $4.5 billion. And if we divide it by about 50 million children under the age of 13, so that turns out to be $90 a year. So that's the budget neutral of replacing the CDC with, and the SNAP dependent care with the child allowance. So we're going to look at the policy engine and see the impact of that. So this, the overall picture, it's the, yeah, that's all right, thank you. So the overall, it's, the budget is very neutral, 9 million out of billions, it's just a counting error. And the poverty doesn't affect poverty much, although 31% people come out ahead and only 6% of people come out behind. Here's the poverty impact by age group. That's not, it doesn't affect poverty.
Trying to make sure everything's visible. There we go.
So the poverty impact doesn't really affect much. In this graph, we see that on average, the lower income deciles do come out ahead, although slightly. And here we can actually see like the bottom 5 income deciles actually come out, although the impact is small. There's still a positive impact. And in this graph, you can see the population share of each income decile and how much come out ahead and and what's the share that come up behind. So, for example, in this third income decile, about 43% of people actually almost 50%, right, come out ahead, and only about 4% actually come up behind in this income decile. And here's the impact on overall inequality, and even though it's a small impact, but by all three measures, it's a positive impact of reducing income inequality. So again, this is like the budget neutral, just replacing with no extra money from the government, right? All right, so anyway, back to Max.
Great, yeah. And I'll just wrap up by talking about, so I'll mention also, this is if you go to policyengine.org, you can sort of play around with your own repealing Cdcc or other kinds of programs, adding a child allowance as you see fit. It's fully customizable. So, all right, there we go. Yeah, so aside from there's really not much of a significant distributional impact from doing this budget neutral replacement, but studies actually do suggest that this would be beneficial for kids in terms of child development. So if you look at studies on subsidized childcare, there were some studies that found, for example, Head Start rolled out between 1965 and 1980. This was a staggered rollout so they could figure out the causal impact of that. And they did find, economists found that it improved educational attainment. But recent studies are a lot more mixed. So there was a study of a program in Quebec, Canada, that found that childcare subsidies actually worsened non-cognitive development, health, life satisfaction, and by the time they're adults, even crime rates. And similarly, a Tennessee program was found to have worsened academic achievement. And some of the theories here are being with your parents is valuable, and sometimes these childcare facilities are not staffed well enough or have enough training, or maybe there's just something special about being with your parents at that age that improves development. And if you contrast that with the really very significant research body on cash assistance for kids, it's essentially entirely uncontroversial that cash assistance improves all outcomes you can think of. So I'm just not linking to a specific study here because there are dozens, but we have a review on the UBI Center, childallowance.ubicenter.org, finding all the studies showing increased cognitive, non-cognitive child development, improved nutrition and health, educational outcomes, and then longer term, there was actually one of the first really long-term studies in the economic literature was of the Mother's Pension Program, which was in 1910 or something. And they tracked those kids who had lower poverty rates growing up over their entire lives, found that it actually increased life expectancy. So really positive outcomes from cash. So just to summarize, what we found is the US tax and benefit system has a lot of programs that effectively condition assistance on childcare consumption. If you replace two of these programs, that's about $4.5 billion, and it's a pretty small child allowance, $90 per year. It's not huge, but it doesn't really, it has a very small impact in terms of improving poverty and inequality outcomes, and empirical research suggests this would be great for kids' development, and of course, move us a little bit more toward basic income. In the future, we intend to expand this research through the Policy Engine app, so adding pre-K, the Child Care Development Fund, and also some of these child care deductions in terms of, whoops, didn't mean to put SNAP in there, housing and TANF. And then, of course, just improving that tool overall in terms of enhancing the survey data to make sure we're really capturing these benefit programs receipt accurately. You could also imagine not just having it the same amount for all kids under age 13, but sort of optimizing that to emulate the current system in terms of childcare consumption. So that is all we had, and we look forward to your questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Max and Tola. So now we'll have the mother-daughter duo over here, Tracy and Emma, who will make a case for direct cash grants to replace food banks as the primary strategy to combat hunger. Or I think it was pulled up earlier. If we can switch back to, there it is, yes.
Perfect. Oh, wonderful, thanks. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about charity and justice, different models. And how do these models work together to support people? And what are the evidence-informed solutions to poverty and food insecurity? So to start with, question, and I realize we're Canadians here, so it's Canadian data that we're using, but hoping you can hazard a guess here. How many food insecure households, that is households that don't have enough to eat, use food banks in Canada? 10 to 25%, 26 to 40%, 41 to 60%, 61 to 80, or 81 to 100? Anybody want to hazard a guess? B, 26 to 40. Yeah? It's A, 21.1% of food insecure households. This is based on work from Valerie Tarasic and colleagues. The vast majority, so that, just going back then, so that means then 80% of folks experiencing hunger in Canada are not using the services that are intended to alleviate poverty. They're intended to do so, but actually nobody gets out of poverty by using charity. So again, they're not actually doing what they're intended to do. Okay, so attributions for poverty. Oh, there should be an I in attributions, but anyway. There are largely four explanations for poverty that are posited in the literature. One is the fatalistic perspective that suggests that people sort of fall into poverty because of bad luck or misfortune, and that's where we get the moniker the misfortunate, right? Somehow there's just bad luck. Second is the structural approach that suggests that it's the environmental considerations that cause poverty, so high unemployment, pandemic, poor economy, lack of jobs or childcare or housing, that sort of thing. And an individualistic perspective that suggests that it's the individual. There's something wrong with the individual that has caused them to be poor, quote, be a poor person. Not be a good person, a poor person. And then there's intergenerational, and we're actually doing some work on intergenerational trends in social assistance use, for example, and this is a big assumption that we have huge numbers in Canada on intergenerational trends in social assistance, but I think it's probably more like 30%. That means, again, the majority, 70%, are not intergenerational. But there's this belief about the constancy of poverty across generations, leading to what has now been debunked in the literature as this culture of poverty. Okay, and my daughter is a big history buff, so she's going to walk us through the history.
So we're going to start with talking about the history of charity a little bit. And so there's sort of been a long history of it with across all faiths and cultures throughout history. And then the birth of social welfare in Canada started in the United Kingdom. In medieval times, parishes, churches, and charitable foundations would spread and provide social welfare in the absence of state-provided income security programs and social services. And the British Poor Laws of 1601 and 1834 in England and Wales, which was then later brought to Canada, created a division between those deemed deserving and undeserving of assistance. And then this relief would later be stigmatized for those who are deemed unworthy, so those who would be sent to workhouses and poorhouses. So the deserving included the infirm, elderly, persons with disabilities, and the undeserving were able-bodied individuals. So the working class. And then historical changes sort of changed people's perspectives on whether or not people were deemed worthy of help. So people sort of changed from a charity-minded view where it's the individual's fault, more so to in the Great Depression or coming back from world wars in the 20th century when people are, disabled or injured and they've lost their jobs because they can't go to work, and the stock market crashed and people realized it wasn't the individual's fault, and so you start to see a change in the social support, and then and then as time passed, we moved back to like an individualistic perspective. But even in like after World War I, when at the Treaty of Versailles, you had like John Maynard Keynes with Keynesian economics, who was suggesting that we should have something more direct to the people who can then give back to the economy to sort of boost the economy for countries that had spent so much money on the world wars. But then back to sort of this charity-minded approach we have now.
Oh, you can't see that at all. So my apologies. So this basically lays out the dimensions of charity on the one side and the dimensions of rights, a rights-based justice model on the other. And I guess what I would just highlight is the fact that when we did research with people using food banks, that the power differential is a really, really significant thing. And the stigma attached to these programs is great, and hence the reason why 80% in Canada, anyway, are not making use of them. We've certainly seen the institutionalization. So in the 1980s, we really saw the rise of food banks in Canada. It was the first one was in Edmonton. And we've institutionalized it as the public response to poverty and food insufficiency. And what we know, too, is that these food banks, community kitchens, and I'm in social work. I've been in social work for a long, long time. So I mean, I have lots of people coming through talking about, they want to be in soup kitchens and gardens and everything. And I'm like, well, the vast majority of people don't use community gardens. They don't use those programs in Canada. And they actually do let governments off the hook from actually grappling with these issues, right? And Poppendeck in the United States has written about that extensively as well. So as I mentioned, no one gets out of poverty by using charitable programs. The fundamental problem, a lack of financial resources, remains unchanged. So unless we're actually giving people money, because that's how we get food, is to buy it, unless we're actually getting income, we're not alleviating poverty. One way, I guess, would be to incorporate a justice model to replace the charitable model. Not to say that we, at one point in London, Ontario, we decided, as the London Poverty Research Centre, we decided that one day that we were going to make an announcement and suggest that we should close down the food banks. And people went nuts because they were like, oh my gosh, like, well, what are we going to do if we don't have the food bank? So the food bank, I mean, they're necessary because without them, people will be hungry, but they're in the absence of something that will actually work, right? Okay, yeah, that's just the definition for food security. People must have the resources necessary to obtain their own food and to do so in normally and socially acceptable ways. And again, normally acceptable ways are to buy it with money in the store. All right, so the solutions. The solutions, well, the literature is vast, documenting many positive health and social benefits from ensuring everybody has a basic income. And we've been through a lot of them through the last couple of days. We're going to talk, I think, have a bit of a discussion about some of the advantages and disadvantages of having more targeted programming. So we can certainly talk about the benefits of having the Canada Child Benefit, and for you, it's the Canada Tax Credit, and talk about the SNAP program and some of the issues with SNAP and issues with stigmatized programming. So maybe I'll just leave it there for now and look forward to the discussion.
All right, thank you. So the first question, we're going to start with just general questions for the whole group, and then later we'll do some specific questions. So the first question is, given there are arguments to be made that direct cash grants are more efficient and effective than child care subsidies, food banks, and in-kind benefits more generally, at bringing about the intended goals of these programs, why do you think that time and again, more targeted programs such as in-kind benefits, vouchers, and subsidies are the policy choices when aiming to combat material hardship?
Because we believe in an individual perspective of poverty, largely. Vast majority of people in government believe in an individual perspective of poverty, that people are going to misuse funds and things like that. So we have to target and ensure that there's lots of conditionality, and conditionality is really about incentives to change behavior, right? Those are behavior modification programs, but poverty is largely systemic. So it's not really, those conditions aren't going to help. I mean, it's going to be helpful to put money into people's hands regardless of if you put conditions attached, but honestly, they would work regardless.
Yeah. I would second that. I think the distrust is a major part of it. I guess a more cynical take also could be that there's a political economy problem where you have a lot of advocacy groups, or in the case of SNAP, for example, the farm lobby is a big proponent of giving people assistance in the form of the stuff that they sell. And you don't really have that kind of broad support in the cash space. You'd have to get all the vendors of every single thing in the country to band together. So there just isn't the focused emphasis that you get from special interests.
All right, thank you. So the next question, what are some of the arguments for offering more targeted funding, such as in the form of housing subsidies, child care subsidies, or free child care? And what are some of the benefits of these more targeted programs?
I guess I think for certain issues, it's probably better to do like for some with positive externalities, like carbon capture technology or something, or benefits for reducing carbon emissions. Then that in-kind might be better, or child allowance. Yeah, child allowance versus child care, and that could be better because it has a long-term positive effect. So, however, well, the ones that I guess that's you only ask for the 4, right?
Yeah,
Argument
whether
so
4
I guess
and.
that's fine.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess it's just the ones that have just the positive externalities.
Yeah, so going through so charity, I think, is its own category, and I think there's literature to suggest that it's obviously, if it's intended to reduce poverty and food insecurity, it doesn't do that, so it's ineffective. It's inefficient, it's unpredictable, it's inadequate. So, I mean, lots of reasons to suggest why we should move away from charity. Housing subsidies, again, if there's a lot of support for variations of different housing. So there's portable housing allowances, there's rent geared to income and subsidized housing and social housing projects. There's lots of variations of housing, but housing is unique. It is interrelated with income security, but I think income security is separate. So when we're talking about these issues, I think we should separate income security from housing, because those things can be helpful. But, and again, as many people have mentioned, basic income is not a panacea, but it certainly can solve financial insufficiency. And then, of course, we would be looking at other things as well in terms of housing. Lots of literature on housing first, in terms of ensuring housing with no readiness requirements and individualized supports. Food vouchers, it's interesting, I went into, because we don't have food vouchers or a SNAP program in Canada, so I wanted to see a little bit about the evidence in relation to your SNAP program. And so I read some folks, economists that were writing, oh, it's wonderful, it lifts all these people out of poverty and, improves food insecurity and whatnot. And then I went to a study that was written by people on the SNAP program, and they were like, We want basic income. We don't want stigmatized programming. We don't want anything at all that identifies that that we need assistance. So in general, stigmatized programming, and as I mentioned earlier with that 21%, the vast majority of people in Canada would rather starve than enter some of these places because the stigma is so great. So anything, again, with stigma is not helpful. There is quite a bit of literature demonstrating that targeted programs can be helpful. So pretty large literature, both in Canada and in the US, for the Canada Child Benefit, for the Canada Tax Credit, for the Earned Income Benefit. We have a Canada Workers Benefit. It's kind of on par with your Earned Income Tax Credit, but ours is so miserly that it's like there's no even point having it. I think it's like $150 for like the year or something. It's totally ridiculous. So so they have to be adequate, I guess is one point. And again, the more conditions you add to targeted programs, the more inefficient they become. And then so the flip side is, well, why would we do universal programs? Or maybe is that a question that's coming up? I don't recall. The problem, I guess, largely with targeted programs is that they're targeted. So that means you're leaving out populations because there's strict eligibility criteria. You're leaving out whole swaths of the population that don't fit that eligibility criteria, right? So great that we have child benefits for families, but those kids are going to grow up and then they're going to age out of the program, and then those parents are getting screwed. Same with we have benefits for seniors and older adults in Canada. That's great that they have that, but then what about that working age population? So it leaves out massive swaths of the population, and that's, again, unnecessary.
If I could just, add, I think also on the externality point, this sort of, the economist's perspective on this would be add conditions when there's sort of a market failure of some sort, and externalities are one of those market failures. So you could imagine this applying to childcare. You could imagine a world in which childcare is actually much more effective for promoting child development, and that's a positive externality on the world because they grow up to be healthier, lower crime, all these kind of positive things for the economy, to say nothing of the fact that they can't choose their own conditions, right? Kids are in the conditions of their families and people who care for them and the government that is in charge of the policies. That happens just empirically not to be the case, but I think it's certainly the case in, for example, malaria bed nets, right? There have been studies showing if you give people cash, it's extremely good for their lives, especially in very low-income countries. If you can find the poorest people on the planet, as Gift Directly does, that makes a huge positive impact on their lives. And still, if you give that money instead, tie it to them essentially buying a malaria bed net, or just buy the bed net for them, GiveWell, which is a charity evaluator, estimates that that's about 10 times more cost-effective than cash, because there is actually an externality. It's not something you think of with malaria, but once you get malaria in an area and it's not contained, it can spread very quickly. It kills kids just like wildfire. So I think there are opportunities like that to identify the kind of interventions where you want to have these targeted programs in developed countries like the US. Childcare is not one of them. I'm pretty skeptical that housing is one of them. I mean, housing vouchers are essentially cash conditioned on you applying for a home, usually many, many times over the course of a decade or something, and then essentially going to wherever you get allocated by the lottery system that puts you on there, or a wait list. I think very few people would want that. I'm skeptical that it would actually help them. There actually are studies from Canada, the Canada Homelessness Experiment, where they gave people in Vancouver a fair amount of cash and accelerated their transitions out of homelessness. So there are always going to be some people who need extra help, especially people with special needs, but that should be the exception. There needs to be, in my view, a real proof that giving them cash is not as good as something else. But cash is a a fine default.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm glad you guys brought up the housing first stuff. Definitely, I think cash is probably the best, but it has been, at least in the United States, very successful in Utah, but it's pretty hard to replicate in places like California that don't have, they don't have enough homes to go around anyway. So it's, definitely gets tricky to get at housing in particular. But we
need to legalize housing, and then it'll be fine. If California was illegal to build housing there, I think, but even in Utah, I haven't seen a study showing that housing first is actually better than cash. So I welcome the researchers in the audience to pursue that research path.
Thank you. All right, so what are some of the responses you guys have received for suggesting that we should replace the in-kind benefits with direct cash grants or more generally basic income?
Well, it's the standard ones, right? It's going to cost too much money. To which, of course, I always say, well, we've opted for the very, very expensive model, right? This is the most expensive model that we could have is large institutionalization. Institutions are very expensive to run, hospitals and mental health facilities. And so going back to the housing piece, like giving people homes is so much cheaper than it is to run all these other facilities, right? There was a study, I think, in Toronto that basically indicated it was like $1,000 a night to have people on the streets and $25 a day to have them in a house. I mean, so economically, this is a very expensive model. But yeah, that's the cost argument is, and then the work disincentive one is the big one. And yet, time and again, we have lots of studies. Gilbert and colleagues, did a study with 16 basic income studies programs around the world and found no substantial impact on labor market participation. But again, this assumption that people are going to just stop working. And we actually just did that in my class, asked people, how many people would stop working if you got a basic income? There was nobody in the class that put up their hand. They're like, oh, it'd be great because, while I'm in between jobs, I can, but there wasn't. There's just these assumptions that we have about what other people are going to do with their money that I think is a really real barrier.
Yeah, on the cost side, so cost of, was the question like concerns about
Yeah, more
UBI?
of like the responses you get from people when you say, yeah, instead of these in-kind benefits, if we want to replace it with a basic income, what are the responses you get from people?
Yeah, I mean, you saw our number, $90 per year. So I think that is the kind of thing that gets pushback. When you buy something for someone, even if it's just a small share of the population that needs it, something like childcare, you're probably giving them hundreds of dollars a year for each of their kids. And then if you dilute that with all the people you're missing because you're setting the conditions, the amount you can give each person is going to be less. So not a lot of people are going to be excited by $90, and sometimes there's a tendency to say, oh, that doesn't matter, right? It's not going to make any difference unless it's below a certain threshold. There's no evidence to support this, of course, and more is better. And I think once you start to take these benefits in a bigger perspective, thinking about the full bundle of benefits we provide, it starts to add up. We've done a few simulations looking at real systemic changes to basic income. My colleague Nikhil did a presentation this morning on a blank slate UBI where you replace a whole bunch of programs and you raise taxes, and that's going to raise enough for a very generous UBI, something that people are really going to think is a serious thing. Of course, it's going to be a big change. But it's going to hugely reduce poverty. And so I think if we think about both what is the big vision and how we get there incrementally and how we measure our progress toward it, it's like anything else. We'll get there. But we can't discount small steps if we're going to think about these targeted programs that ultimately fail to reach a whole bunch of people.
One of the questions that didn't get asked, I guess, that I thought was important to consider is what are the benefits of universal programs? because it was like, what are the benefits of targeted programs? There's quite a bit of literature talking about the benefits of universal programs. You get buy-in, right? Like if everybody's benefiting from that, then everybody wants it. They're less subject to erosion over time. There's literature that they actually can prevent right-wing extremist governments, reduce hate crime, improve communities. There's a swath of literature that should be looked at, looking at universal programs and the value of those. Now, that being said, we had our Canada Child Benefit Program was a universal program. It was a demogrant model, gave like $100 essentially to families. And then with the most recent government, they changed it and made it income tested. And with having income tested, it's been able to really cut at child poverty, or at least that's what the government is telling us. Between 2019 and 2020 alone, it reduced child poverty by 4% because it was really getting at the bottom and increasing those incomes substantially. So there are benefits to universality, but there's also real benefits to targeted programs when they're effective.
Thank you. So this one is for Tola and Max. A child allowance, to some extent, is still a targeted guaranteed income, as it would only go to households with children. What are the arguments for offering a child allowance in lieu of a more universal basic income?
We were all children at one day. So I think it's actually the most universal program you could get would be a baby bonus. So give $1,000 to every family for every child they have. The child allowance is for the kids. It's very expensive to raise kids, so if it helps them as well, that's great. But I think there's a preconception that child allowances are really for parents, and that's, I think, kind of the backwards way to look at it. So I am all for UBI, but I think if we're going to start with something it's kind of tongue-in-cheek, but start with something we all receive at some point that we all benefit from, and that has the biggest bang for the buck. Child allowances, the research is so huge, not just in terms of the bullets we shared before, in terms of the breadth of outcomes that it improves, but the magnitudes are enormous. So relieving adulthood poverty, I think, is a moral imperative as well, but child poverty is going to have a bigger impact on society overall. Both in the near term, in terms of educational outcomes, parents are very likely to be in poverty, so if you want to reduce adult poverty, this is a cost-effective way of doing it, and also in terms of ultimately the stability of our society.
Well, thank you. And for Tracy and Emma, you argue for cash grants to replace food banks. So would you argue for food subsidies or unconditional cash grants with no restrictions on what the cash can be used for, and why?
Unconditional. Absolutely. Right? I mean, it's against the assumptions of we want to tell people what to buy, right? What they need. Well, who are we to tell other people what they need? Again, it's because we don't trust people enough to make good decisions, right? And we know in the literature that it's a very flawed thinking, that people do know what's best for them and their families. So obviously, unconditional.
Anything to add? No? So this will be the last question before we open up to Q&A. So the last is just thinking about the future and moving forward. What do you think is the first best step as we move forward towards direct cash?
Yeah, I do think there's a lot of opportunity on the child front, because another advantage of a child allowance is it's less expensive to get something. If people have this mental blocker around, under $100 doesn't really make a difference, well, that's more attainable if you're limiting it by age. And you can limit even further. Maybe it's a really young child allowance, just a UBI for kids under age 5, or just this baby bonus idea. It's also a lot easier than to have that scale all across the country or the world. You can have local governments, state governments, all trying different versions of these baby bonuses, the young child allowances, and really experimenting with the universality, which is the income testing often fails to reach the poor because you have to rely on filing taxes. You create different work incentives for parents compared to people who don't have kids, which isn't really make sense to discourage parents from working more than you discourage other people from working. And yeah, so I think really two fronts in my view, the child allowances, which can be scaled very easily, and then the second would be something that Canada is really leading on, which is a carbon dividend. You can have a carbon tax. It's going to be the most cost-effective, it's a budget-neutral policy, so it's kind of a strange framing, but it's a very, very effective policy for averting carbon emissions, and it's a way to start having a universal program, phase it up over time, and have all of these be a distinguishing factor from the array of targeted benefit programs that really enact a lot of conditions on people, and especially low-income people.
So in Canada, I think we're working on trying to get consensus on what a basic income is across the different constituencies. So unlike a lot of people in the US, where people have been really advocating for UBI, people in Canada are arguing or advocating for guaranteed income, largely because we already have infrastructure to support that. I mean, like I said, our Canada Child Benefit is an income-tested model, has been shown to reduce poverty. Same thing with our pension benefits for older adults. Our guaranteed income supplement is a partial form of basic income for older adults. So we already have those forms, and we already have it in the tax structure itself to be able to do that. And there's also a sense that if we went with a universal model where everybody gets the same amount, that for folks that are not in the workforce for a variety of reasons, well, I guess essentially the assumption being that it would be so a meager amount that it would not be adequate to support people who don't have other sources of income. So we are hoping to start at least with an income-tested model, and then hopefully move down the road to be able to get something more universal in terms of a demo-grant model. Well, for some people are fine with an income-tested model. So.
All right, so I think we'll open it up now to Q&A from the audience. We'll just move that mic, the last one, if we could just move that back down.
So this is a question for the Smith carriers. So just do you happen to know if there's any data like on to what degree is the bad take-up rate for food banks in Canada related to stigma versus, say, like access, proximity? Because I know in Canada, for example, a large degree of the impoverished are in the rural western provinces, where I wouldn't expect there to be a huge amount of food banks. I know in the United States, one of the issues with rural poverty is that the access to any sort of charitable or governmental support services is very bad, because a large amount of our impoverished live in places like the Dakotas, Montana, which are very, very rural areas, very little infrastructure. So do you happen to know if there's to what degree can we make the consideration, and what degree does a cash benefit help to alleviate the problem that poor rural infrastructure poses for poverty in Canada?
Well, I think.
Okay, so Joshua Miller, UBI Center. So my question is for the Smith carriers, and it's basically to what degree do we know the poor take-up rate for food banks in Canada, if it's related to stigma versus things like, say, access? Because I know in Canada and the United States, one of the issues with both food bank access, but also taking up any sort of charity or governmental assistance for the poor or for food, is in a lot of rural areas, there's very poor infrastructure. and very bad access. I know in Canada, a large amount of the impoverished are in the rural western provinces. So to what degree do we know if that's impacting the poor take-up rate? And also if like something like a direct cash transfer or cash benefits would help to alleviate that problem more so than in-kind benefits in terms of access for things like rural areas.
Yeah, I think you hit it right on the head. I think it is a confluence of factors. So stigma obviously is one of them, but yes, access is another big one. And so people that we've talked to often say, you know, I can't get there. It's in these remote places that there's no bus access to, or even if they had bus access, do they really want to carry all their groceries on the bus or on a bike or something like that? Or they have kids, and so it makes it very, you know, difficult to access these places. So yeah, access is a big piece as well. But also there's an assumption, you know, for people that don't use food banks that using those food banks is adequate. And the reality of it is you know, in Canada, they basically give you enough food for 3 days. So I always say, like, well, what do you do with the other, you know, 27 days of the month? So the adequacy is a problem, the access, inaccess is a problem, the stigma is a problem, lots of issues. But also the disrespect that people experience with people feeling that they are looked down upon from people, volunteers and whatnot. So yeah, so lots of issues. If the cash went directly into people's pockets, we would sidestep all of those issues.
Thanks. Sid Frankel, University of Manitoba. I'm going to try and get 2 questions in. First of all, on child benefits. Child benefits probably have 2 functions, a horizontal equity function. Children are social goods, and parents need to be compensated for doing the social work of raising children. But also the vertical equity you've talked about. We need to eliminate poverty for children. In some ways, the Canada Child Benefit is a combination of both. Around 95% of Canadian families with children do receive the benefit. So I'm interested in your points of view on whether both of these types of equity can be served to child benefits and what the design should be.
I guess, is there, I mean, universal child benefits would certainly meet both those goals. Is that right? I think the problems we have in the US, I'm curious on the Canada perspective, how 95% of folks receiving it, that is pretty far from what we have in the US, where it's only about, I think, 80% of eligible families receive it because it's through the tax code. The poorest families don't file taxes, so they don't get it. So if you look at the take-up rate among children in, for example, deep poverty, I think it's about half, somewhere around there. So this is a problem you don't see in countries like Ireland, Finland, that have truly universal child benefits. You don't see it with Social Security in the US, which is it's not the same amount, but it basically goes to every old person. And there's pretty much nobody who is not reached by that program. So this is, I think, in the US, we just have one branch of government that gives money to people and does it very effectively to especially low-income people and kind of in these universal realms. The Social Security Administration has over 1,000 offices across the country. And then you have the IRS, which just utterly fails to achieve the goals. So from that perspective, I think the universal piece, as Senator Romney has proposed, Representative Tlaib has proposed, is probably more likely to achieve those aims.
I used to be a big believer in the universality of the Canada Child Benefit, the Demogrant model. I loved it because everybody got it and all of those pieces. But then when we did move into this income-tested benefit and I saw the massive decreases in child poverty, they were still able to make sure that the vast majority of parents got it, but it was really targeting like people at the bottom to make sure that those incomes really went up, and yet the people who are more higher income still largely were able to receive something. So they still had the benefit of feeling like, oh, I've got something. And so I think actually that the model that we've got now is working so much better than that $100.
Yeah, I think it is a compromise. I and others have argued for a steeper benefit reduction curve in the Canada Child Benefit to increase its poverty reduction focus. Thank you. Let me ask my...
Sorry, could I add one quick follow-up to that? I'm curious of your second question as well. But I think one other part of the horizontal equity is horizontal equity in terms of the labor market for parents and non-parents. And right now, those are very different. You can be a single person, and your marginal tax rate might be 30% if you're earning, let's say, $50,000 a year. And now if you have a child, that's going to go up from 30% to, it could be 70%. And that's basically more than cutting your wage, the actual amount that you get paid for every hour that you work. You're in the same job, but someone who's in the same job as you, doesn't have kids, is making two times as much as you are. So I don't see a societal justification for that. And that's the kind of system that means-tested child benefits, which is where most of the means testing is. It's for families with kids. That's what that produces. Sorry.
Good point. I'm thinking about the two options you've talked about, universal benefits versus targeted subsidies or targeted benefits. I'm wondering about a third option, and just to use the example of childcare, a third option is to take childcare out of the market and to provide for government to finance the actual delivery of childcare. And that's essentially what's happened in Canada, that government is moving towards financing the bulk of it. Parents will still pay something, but it'll be actually quite a small part of the costs of childcare. $10 a day or less. $10 would be the maximum in the current plan. So I'm wondering about what you think about this more supply side option of government directly financing a public service like childcare.
I think it runs into the same problem in the subsidies in most ways, in the sense that there still will be some families who don't participate because, both Tola and I are from immigrant families. My dad is from Argentina. My grandparents lived with us. It's very common in immigrant families to have these multi-generational households, and you get help from your friends and family instead of wanting to send your kids to government facilities or private facilities. So I think that's one problem that persists. And also just empirically, I could be wrong, maybe but I think the Quebec program that was evaluated that found pretty negative impacts was a government-run program instead of a subsidy program. Do you happen to know?
There was positive results from the Quebec program, largely, I thought.
We'll share this study in the paper and online, hopefully. But yeah, that was found to worsen non-cognitive development of the kids. It was a pretty seminal study a couple years ago. So the evidence base still, I think, even if you take away that study, the evidence base is so much stronger that the government could use all those funds to reduce poverty directly via cash transfers instead of either subsidizing private childcare or running public childcare facilities.
We are moving towards that in Canada, towards what Sid was talking to about the actual institutionalization of childcare on a $10 a day model. There's lots of literature talking about childcare as being publicly provided childcare as increasing child development outcomes and whatnot. So we've had this debate for a long, long time in Canada, and a lot of people are like, it's taken 50 years for us to get childcare. For a long time, it was the Canada tax, before it became Canada Child Benefit, used to be the Canada tax credit, and it wasn't enough to provide for childcare. So I think a lot of people are like, somebody like me who had 3 kids and was paying $20 $200 a month in childcare for one kid, would welcome a $10 a day model.
Welcome it more than cash of the same
Oh,
amount?
absolutely.
Huh, okay.
Not to beat a dead horse, but I do have a question about what we're talking about now, the child care versus universal benefits. Not that I don't support child care benefits. I was quite recently a child, so I feel like that was pretty great that those exist. But now that Western countries are starting to face like a big problem with aging populations, like if we increase a lot of our public funds to really young populations, I feel like there could be issues that we're leaving an increasingly larger portion of Western populations behind. So how would a child, like a targeted child care benefit, help these larger portions of aging populations who are starting to deal with also like incredibly high healthcare costs, especially in the US? And then, yeah.
We already have quite a few programs for old folks. So it depends on the country, but I think in general, senior poverty is lower than child poverty. It might be kind of close right now in the US, but that's just from like the American Rescue Plan program. So I think that's a temporary change. So yeah, I'm not gonna steal money from old folks to give it to kids exactly, but I think if you're looking at ROI from a societal perspective on the current margin from where we are today, there's probably more to be gained from child benefits.
Well, we have sort of a combination of different programs for older adults in Canada. In the 1970s, we had essentially 40% of older adults were living in poverty, and because we instituted like that package of programming, basically a form of basic income for older adults, that poverty rate went from 40 down to 4%. We essentially eliminated poverty for older adults because of having these programs that made sure that they had cash in their pockets. Now the problem is now those programs are steadily eroding, and although they're indexed, they're not indexed appropriately, and so poverty is rising for that population. So yeah, we need to go back and make sure that those programs are robust and provide and are adequate to meet people's needs.
I'll add one controversial part of this, which is part of the difficulty with an aging population. You're seeing this in Japan, for example, is you don't have the workforce to care for them.
Yeah.
If you go to the hospital, it's very understaffed. Just as you age, you need more and more help from people who are of working age. And we are very much at risk of following in their footsteps. The effect of child benefits on fertility, on the number of children born, is not huge, but it's not zero either. So it is a way, if we were really trying to address depopulation, we would invest even more in child benefits, which would then make our aging population more able to receive the care they need.
Thank you.
All right, I want to know we have 5 minutes left. We might not be able to get, you can ask your question. I just want to give everyone a heads up.
Thanks. Just one very small comment and then a question is, I think, and on the question of cash versus in-kind, it's important to think about availability of supply, which is very obvious, but childcare is a good example of where there is a limit to the degree to which cash can have an impact if you have a constrained supply in terms of childcare providers. And I think that gets at the first person's question a little bit about food supply as well. And we saw that I worked in sub-Saharan Africa the last decade in direct cash work, and we saw this as kind of a major constraint. That being said, one thing we're about to roll out a pilot for childcare providers to provide guaranteed income to low-income childcare providers caring for low-income families, and particularly in communities of color. And so this, isn't necessarily speaking to the policies that you spoke about today, but to the child care subsidy program. And so I'm interested in what evidence, if any, you found around the efficacy of direct cash on the supply side to child care providers, and if you see that has any kind of outcomes in terms of improved child outcomes as they're more responsive and engaged caregivers, or in terms of kind of labor market outcomes in terms of a stabilized child care workforce. So interested if you came across any of that in your research related to childcare.
I know in Quebec, when they instituted their childcare program, that initially used to be $5 a day, and then it went up to $10 a day, and then they changed it again. But they found massive amount of women going into the workplace, and so yeah, there was a huge increase in labor market participation because of the program.
Yeah, I'm not sure of studies on this, but I think it's a very similar question on the housing side. Folks advocate for housing subsidies because there's a shortage of housing. Subsidizing either childcare or housing does not make it easier to provide the supply of it in terms of the actual resources involved. It shifts some of those resource constraints from private individuals to the government. But on the childcare side, for example, the demand for childcare doesn't really change that much. So it's really, are you subsidizing one form of it compared to the at-home care? And again, I think it's really the question of where's the biggest return, and I think the outcomes for kids are what speaks most to that.
The only I would say is if the supply is, like if they're currently receiving under market rate compensation, then these subsidies, like in your opinion, sorry, I know there's not a question, but do you think, if you're talking about people who should be paid at market rate, but because of the types of households they're providing services to, they're forced to charge below market rate rates, do you have kind of any hypothesis about the degree to which you think that will actually change outcomes? Because to your point, if you're just shifting it, it's different than if you're actually supplementing it.
Well, you're paying parents zero to stay at home under that model. That seems also too low to me, right? So I think the right way to make sure that people who are providing childcare are receiving as much compensation as possible is to give parents as much disposable income as possible, and then they can use that to pay themselves or to pay other people.
Okay.
Hi, Michelle Abbott from Pittsburgh. I just want to say that generally, I think that cash is always better than in-kind services, and I think the child tax credit was like the best policy we've had come out recently. But I also think listening to your presentation convinced me that this policy is not good and that the childcare subsidies is better. And I'm wondering if I misunderstood something. So the graph you showed, that was like generally 43% of people would be better off, right? That's because they're having an extra $90 in their pocket per year per kid? That's what it is. Okay. And then 4% of people would be worse off because they would lose childcare subsidies. So childcare subsidies, like in Pennsylvania, the median cost of childcare is $290 per month, so which is like, or per week, which is like $15,000. So the people who are worse off, even though it's 4%, which is a small percentage, is actually a large quantity of children whose families are now out like $10,000 plus per kid per year. And like everyone else is better off because they have an extra $90. And so I think there's a lot of variation in what that looks like when it plays out. And it's not just like these people are better off and these people are worse off. It's like these people are better off by this amount and these people are worse off by this huge amount. And so generally, I think like the child tax credit was great and it went to a larger swath of people. But when you're talking about replacing childcare subsidies in this current context without actually replacing the subsidy with that same amount of cash, it's like really harmful potentially.
Yeah. I guess, again, it comes back to the parents who are essentially using at least $10,000 of resources to provide childcare themselves and getting zero today. So do we want to have a system that penalizes that choice compared to spending $10,000 to send your kids to a facility? And these are things I think we can quantify, and that's what we aim to do. So it does slightly reduce poverty. It slightly reduces inequality. So I think the way in which it's worse off is if you have some attachment to the status quo, what people are receiving today. And that's going to be a tough line to stick to if we're trying to make systemic change like UBI.
Yeah, I guess it's less my connection to status quo and more that, it's really important to run these models at a national level or international level, but you lose a lot of variation in what that means for individual households. And so, like, okay, if you're a stay-at-home parent, you're donating $10,000 worth of labor to childcare or whatever. But most of the people who are stay-at-home have a stay-at-home parent, also have another parent who's working that is in a job that pays well enough. So it's also a different segment of the population who's donating that labor. Whereas if you have two parents potentially who are working low-income, low-wage jobs, they're not. If one of them has to stay home, when they're donating that $10,000 for an extra $90 in their pocket, their kids are way less well off. Like, their kids are now potentially suffering from not getting food on the table or keeping a roof over their head or whatever. So it's not just this like one-to-one, like big picture, more people are better off. It's like when we talk about the big picture, which is like also very important, you can't lose sight of the negative impacts on the tails because they're huge potentially.
Yeah, I'd be interested to see the data. My sense is that there are a lot of single parents who provide home care for their kids, or people who don't have a high-earning spouse or partner. And in those cases, we will capture in the poverty and inequality statistics. But yeah, it's an interesting empirical question.
Thanks.
All right, and we're going to have to close it there. That was a very interesting ending to our conversation. If we get a round of applause for our wonderful panelists of speakers. Thank you guys so much. And thank you all for attending.